Love spine-tingling stories that keep you up at night? On this channel, we bring you original scary stories narrated to send chills down your spine. Hit like if you enjoy the scares and subscribe so you don't miss a story that will haunt your imagination long after the lights go out. So, without further ado, here is an unexplained paranormal experience of the well-known prison, Alcatraz. The Last Watch on Rock. They brought me to Alcatraz at dusk, the sky already a bruise. The transport rocked like a coffin on a slow sea. The island rose from fog the way a drowned thing surfaces. The guards called it the Rock with a kind of reverence you reserve for natural disasters. I called it home for the time being, because at that point names didn't matter. Only cells did. My cell was small enough for one body and a handful of regrets. Concrete walls, a narrow cot with springs that complained when you moved, a stainless sink that tasted of old salt. A narrow window slit looked out toward the black blot of San Francisco, where lights were held by the living. In the beginning, the island felt like a wound on the map, sharp, contained. The first nights I slept like the dead, simply because sleep let me forget the hum of the generators, the distant chime of the foghorn, the way the wind made the single light in the corridor bend like a question mark. They warned us about the rules. No talking after lights out, no leaning at the door, no friendly gestures with the guards. But rules on the Rock were formalities, and the real law there was space and silence. The silence is not empty, it listens. It shapes itself to the narrowness of your chest and begins to answer back. It started small. A shadow behind the grate, a pause in the clatter of the mess hall that felt like a held breath. Whispers at the edge of sleep that braided themselves into names I hadn't heard since the year my son was born. I thought it was the isolation, the slow ache of floors and iron. I told myself stories, sensible, boring explanations, drafts, rats, tricks of exhausted hearing. Then the lights and the tears began to die one by one, not with the thin click of a circuit, but like bodies being snuffed. You could feel the dark move with a weight. It pooled at the foot of the stairs, and when you passed it, you had the sense of being measured. The guards tightened their eyes and didn't speak to us about it. They were men who had worked long enough to know when the world held its breath for a reason, and they had learned the advantage of small silences. I met an old man in the laundry room, peeling thread off a shirt with fingers like calloused keys. He said his name was Ellis, and he had been moved to the Rock before I was born. He had the look of someone who had wandered through a storm and collected the fragments. "The island remembers," he told me, each word a coin in his clenched palm. "And when it gets hungry, it asks for company." I laughed because that's what you do with superstition. Laugh so it becomes ordinary. But the laundry room was colder than the rest of the building, the steam hissing from the washers like a mouth exhaling. In the mirrored surface of the dryer I saw, brief as lightning, a face not my own, a face reaching from the other side of the glass with an expression I could not read. When I turned, the old man was gone. His pile of shirts remained, folded. The first unmistakable thing that belonged to the other world arrived with the morning mail. A photograph slipped under my cell door. It was grainy, black and white, the edges chewed as if by teeth. In the picture, a group of men stood on a uniform line in front of the cell block. Blank faces, 2 guards, a small boy holding a toy. None of them were me. I knew every face I had ever photographed. I knew the faces of my childhood. These were different. One man stared straight into the lens, and his eyes were stained with a hunger I felt in the pit of my stomach. On the back of the photo in looping, careful script, "Watch the light. It keeps time for us." I pinned that photograph to the wall. It was ridiculous to be placated by paper. It was also necessary, some small human ritual to stake a claim against erasure. That night, the light above my cell blinked in the same cadence as the foghorn. Long, short, short. I knew that cadence. It was the same pattern as the Morse code drilled into our heads during basic training, the kind of thing you keep in muscle memory long after it's useless. But when I translated it with trembling fingers, it spelled my name. There are noises in the prison that you do not notice until you have to. The scraping of a mop across tile, footsteps that don't match a human gait, the low thrum beneath everything like the time a heart beats in a jar. On the 3rd week, I woke to feel someone standing at the foot of my cot. I sat up and the door was there, its iron bones sucking at the light. The figure was thinner than any living man, taller than the mold of a cell door. It had the economy of hunger. No wasted bone, no unnecessary pause. I should have called out. I didn't. The old instinct in me was to measure danger before announcing it. There had been too many nights in life where shouts were wasted. Instead, I watched as the figure traced its fingers along the heavy bar of the door, and wherever its hands passed, the plaster beneath them glowed faintly with something that wasn't light but memory. In the morning, a perfect set of small handprints remained on the inside of the iron, as if a child had been grasping, pleading. That day in the yard, the men moved like sleepwalkers. Conversations dwindled, cigarettes burned untouched. Even the seagulls flew in crooked circles as if they too were checking the lock. Ellis told me something in the pale noon light, about the men who'd been carried into the sea and never surfaced, about a woman who had waited on a promontory for a lover who never returned. The island was a ledger, he said, and every human imprint had weight. You hear them, he said, not as a question. His voice was dry as a cedar box. They keep their hours. That night the cell block sang. It was a low, circular melody, like a canter across concrete. A man on the lower tier began to hum a note, not words, and others joined, first softly, then with a clarity that felt like a vow. The tune threaded through bars and stairwells, threading itself into the skulls of the sleeping men. I woke with a chorus inside my head that matched the rhythm of the photograph, the same cadence as the foghorn, the same short, long, short timing that had spelled my name. The song pushed at me with cold fingers and then shaped into a sentence that thudded in my chest. Open the door. Come with us. I tried to be rational. Prisoners play tricks on one another. We whisper and scheme. We invent ghosts to make the nights less flat. But there were rules in those whispers, a shared syntax. Men who'd never spoken in the yard seemed to know the hymn as well as the melody of their own mother tongues. They sang it with tenderness and a ferocity that did not belong to their living voices. The effect was to make the ordinary world seem show. You could see where the door had been stitched to the sky. I began to dream in corridors. No, not dream, to be precise. To walk them with waking eyes. The cell's single light would beam, and I would find myself outside of time, following a stair that spiraled down instead of up. The iron steps were slick with something that smelled like pennies and old rain. At the bottom, there was a room I'd never seen in the maps shipped out to families. A dining hall with plates rimed in frost, faces sitting in empty chairs. They lifted their heads in unison and looked at me and then at one another, like a jury awaiting a verdict. Do you remember? They asked. The voice came not from a throat but from the walls. Memory, wrongly understood, sounds like accusation. I tried to resist. I counted breaths. I recited my son's name aloud until it tasted like stone. But memories are porous on the rock. You can pour in other people's and they will leak into you. Week by week, I found myself filling with stories that were not mine. I could feel the pressure of drowned lungs, the way a band at the wrist had hung for a lifetime. If I closed my eyes, I saw the echo of a handshake that had been more violent than business, a ledger written in the backs of heads. The island fed these stories back to us at night, in the shapes of figures and the grooves of old scabs. The guards stopped patrolling with the same cadence. Their eyes glazed. Some disappeared from the rosters like names erased from a ledger. One guard, a man named Cutter with a jaw like a paperclip, vanished without record between the breakfast bell and the noon roll call. They told us he had been reassigned. Later, we found his boots in the laundry room, filled with sand that had dried to concrete. I began to write letters I never meant to send. I wrote to my son about the weather and the small victories, and then, smaller still, about the light that sometimes tilted toward the cell and lingered in the corner in a way that felt like company. My letters stayed inside the drawer. I folded them into the same drawer as the photograph. Sometimes, late at night, I would open the drawer and find another photograph there with no explanation. An empty chair in a mess hall, a pair of boots by a bunk, a soft imprint in the snow on the yard. They were always for me to see and never for me to own. The phenomena escalated the night of the storm. They kept the island lights on that night, full beam, a salute to the sea. The fog settled like a sheet. The ocean hammered the breakwaters as if the world were knocking itself against a door. The light in my cell did not blink. It went out with the sound of something huge being sealed. The hum of the generators faded, And then, in the exact, oppressive silence that followed, the island moved. Doors slammed on 100 locks at once. The chorus rose, and now it was not a melody but a language, an elemental, rhythmic pounding like gavel against iron. The men in the block were on their feet as if pulled by strings. Their faces were empty, their eyes gone. The figures in the shadows had mass now, and they moved with purpose. I felt my body being unmoored, dragged by a rope of memory toward the central corridor, toward the long, bricked hallway we used to call the backbone. The wall pulsed to my touch like a living thing, warm, then cold. In the lantern glow, the bricks showed impressions, like the fossilized outline of hands and shoes. At the end of the hallway, a door that I had passed 100 times had been opened. It led to the part of the rock that was no map at all, a small cove of concrete and iron where the island's bones met the sea. The tide had receded in a way that exposed a narrow channel, one that had not been there any morning in my memory. The water in the channel was black as oil and slicked with a film that reflected faces like a funhouse mirror. They, those who were not living but would not be called dead, stood along the channel in a line that mimicked the photograph pinned to my wall. Their faces were not faces, but the idea of faces, blurred, as if seen through rain. They looked like prisoners and guards wound together until you could not tell which had been which. One of them stepped forward. He wore a jacket that smelled of lentil soup and mothballs. His mouth opened, and the sound that came out was the foghorn and grief at once. "Come," he said. Simple. No menace in the syllable, only the relentless patience of the sea. I should have fled. I did not. I stepped forward because steps were now the only language I had left. The surface beneath my boots was not stone at all but the backs of books, accounts, ledgers, the names of men erased from the living registry. Each name thudded through me. I tasted salt and iron and the faint warmth of a child's hand. When I reached the water's edge, a shape rose from the black like an apology. It was a small boat, carved from the island itself. Inside it sat a single life vest, and inside the life vest, folded like a letter, lay the photograph that had been tucked in my drawer. The man who had been a face in that picture reached out his hand to me. His fingers were old wood. "You once promised," he said, and the words were current. "You promised to come back." I had promised nothing to him. I had promised things to my son, to myself, to no one. The island did not care for legalities. It required company. It required recognition. It wanted to be acknowledged as more than myth. You could keep the bones of a man locked in a ledger, but if the ledger is read aloud by a chorus that grew and grew until it filled the sky, who keeps count? I took the hand. It was not painful. It was not the cold that we call death. It was a pressure, an understanding like the press of a finger along the spine of a book. In that pressure, I saw 100 little lives like postage stamps, a laugh swallowed, a promise unkept, a watch passed down to the sea. The island was not content with bodies. It wanted stories arranged neatly, their edges filed. It wanted the market of regrets closed. I do not know how long we floated. Time unraveled like twine. The men who had followed me hummed the cadence that had been my name, and in the chorus I felt my name slipping from me, becoming another strand. When the boat scraped the far side of the channel, I expected that I would step out and find the other shore a place of bright sun, a city I would know. Instead, we came up against a wall of fog that smelled of laundry and old tobacco. On the other side of that fog, there were no lights, no city. There were only other cells, other faces, all rooms that folded into each other. Somewhere inside that fog, I saw Ellis again, younger, with his fingers whole. He lifted a hand, and then the hand dissolved like smoke. He smiled. Maybe he had been smiling all along. Maybe that smile had been the payment that allowed him to be free. Or maybe he simply had the better sense to bend to the terms of the island sooner. They say that Alcatraz closed in '63. History has maps and dates. Ghosts have other calendars. In the end, the rock keeps its own ledger. The men who claimed they escaped wrote stories afterward about a river of cold and a current that spit them out at dawn onto a bay more alive than the island ever was. They had bruises shaped like old cuffs. They carried the taste of iron and salt in their mouths. They woke as if from surgery with a sensation of fingers inside their chests, rearranging organs like coins. I do not know whether those men were spared, or whether they carried the rock inside them like a second heartbeat. As for me, This is what I know to be true. Sometimes, when the wind moves just so through my windows and the foghorn in the distance plays the old cadence, when my son calls on the telephone, and I hear the faintest scrape of a hand along metal in the pause before he answers, sometimes I think I can feel the rock pressing back. It hums to keep time for the missing. It hums to remind us that debts are paid in company, that silence can be an appetite, and that isolation can be a door. If you ever find yourself on a ferry that skirts the island at dusk, and the guide points to the long brick face and says, smiling, that it is only a relic, look closer. The windows are dark. The water at the edge sometimes holds the reflection of a face that isn't in the city. If you feel the hairs along the back of your neck rise at the sound of the foghorn, long, short, remember that it's a message written in waves. And if, by some mischance, a photograph slides under your door with no envelope and no reason, read it carefully. The island loves to be read aloud. It loves names. Last night, my son asked me, out of a child's simple, enduring curiosity, if I ever felt lonely. I wanted to tell him about the hands on the iron, the photographs, the song. Instead, I told him the truth and a half. Sometimes, but I've learned to listen. There was a pause. In that pause I heard, faint as a bone under crust, a pair of palms fold together as if in prayer. Okay, he said. He didn't know what else to say, and neither did I. I have written this because people like records. The rock likes records too. It likes them read aloud. Sometimes at night I wake and press my palm against the window of my apartment and imagine the salt in the air. A thin, familiar ache, and trace, in my mind, the outline of those iron bars. The photograph that lives now in the back of my drawer is less crisp than it used to be. The faces are beginning to blur, as if the ink itself remembers too many names. There is a rhythm to these things. There is always a tide. The rock waits. It writes in the intervals between lights the names of those who arrive to keep it company. If you ever hear the song, heed the cadence. Learn your own name. Say it aloud before the fog turns it into someone else's. Thanks for listening. If you're brave enough for more, hit subscribe and join us for the next story that will haunt your imagination. Until next time, keep the lights on.